All right, everyone, how's it going? So this one is going to be a tutorial video where I'm going to be showing you how to build an online marketplace, kind of like Facebook Marketplace, where you can go and list items and other people can come potentially buy those items from you. And we're going to be building all this with the T3 Stack. And more specifically, we are going to be using something a little bit different than what we normally do. So instead of using next.auth, we're going to be using something called Clerk. I do want to say that Clerk is the sponsor of this video, and we're going to be using this service to basically set up the authentication with next.js. I will say it's very easy to hit the ground running with Clerk, and I'm actually pretty surprised by the documentation and how easy it is to kind of get set up. I could sit here and probably talk about all the features of Clerk, but I think just showing you how easy it is to use might be a better use of our time. So let's just go ahead and create a T3 Stack application. You know the drill. We'll go to create.t3.gg. And I'm going to copy this create command. For those of you who do not know what the T3 Stack is, basically it's just a collection of opinionated tools that you can use to build out full stack applications. We have next.js. You got to use TypeScript, of course. gRPC for the communication between the front end and the back end. We got Prisma for the database. We got Tailwind CSS for the styling. And then you have the ability to install next.auth if you want, but we are going to be using Clerk like I mentioned. So let's go over to my terminal. I'm going to go ahead and just create a T3 app, and I want to go ahead and name it as Online Marketplace. Go ahead and run through this. It says you need to install the following packages. I will say yes. We want TypeScript. We want Prisma, Tailwind, and gRPC. We don't want next.auth right now. Let's say yes, we want to initialize a Git repo. Would you like to run npm install? Yes. Would you like to, what input alias would you like to configure? That's fine. So while this is setting up, let's also go over to GitHub, and I'm going to make a new repository called Online Marketplace. So Online Marketplace, and we are going to make this public in MIT license so that all you guys can grab this and do whatever you want with it. Go ahead and create that repository. I'll put this link in the description of the video if you ever want to come back in the future and see how this code was done. All right, so now that that is done running, we can go ahead and cd into the Online Marketplace directory we just created. We're going to npx prisma db push. And then we're going to npm run dev. So cd online marketplace, npx prisma push, npm run dev. Let's just verify this is working, and then I will do some more steps of setup. All right, so there we go. We got a T3 app set up and ready to go. Now, one thing I do want to do is I want to connect my local repo to this one we just created. Let's just go ahead and grab this whole git command here. This is just because I set up the repo locally first and I didn't set up the origin. So in your repo, you can actually do a git remote -v, and that'll tell you if you have any origin set up. We don't. So I'm going to say remote add origin, and I'll go ahead and paste in that URL there. And then I'm going to go ahead and just say initial commit, and then I will say git push origin main. I might have to use a force. Let's see. All right. So now we have all that code pushed up to the repo, and we should be good to go. So I'm also going to open that directory here in VS Code because I haven't done that yet. Okay, so that's all the boilerplate for setting up the T3 Stack. It's running one command, selecting some options, and then going ahead and committing that to a repo. So the next steps is let's go ahead and try to set up Clerk. All right, so if you go to clerk.com and log in, you can set up an account with like Google or GitHub. I'm going to go ahead and add an application here. So this is what you need to do if you want to set up some type of new authentication in a new app. So I'll click Add Application. We're going to call this Online Marketplace. And you can go through here, and let me kind of show you all the options that Clerk provides you. You can basically get social media logins with any of these out of the box. You do GitHub, Twitter, Facebook, Google, email if you want. I'm going to go ahead and just say Google, and then we're going to say GitHub. Okay, there might be another one we could probably try doing in this video. I mean, we could do Discord, Twitch, TikTok, a lot of options, right? And the benefit of Clerk is that I don't have to go and like configure my social media OAuth keys. Kind of does that for you out of the box, and it gives you this nice little login window when you try to actually register or log in your app. And also the email option, I believe, will give you a magic link email if you want. But we're just going to keep it simple right now. We'll do Google and GitHub. Hopefully that's cool enough for you all. We'll say create application. And once you have the application set up, you can go ahead and follow their quick start guides. They have a lot of documentation for all these different frameworks. But what we want to do is we want to use next.js. So it says here we need to copy this stuff and put it in .env local. So let's just go ahead and copy this. And I'm going to go ahead and just paste it inside of this. And when you modify your .env, it's always a good idea to go to your example env and make sure you have something basic here. So I'll say like replace me here, just so that if anyone were to clone this repo, they're not confused as to like what they need to do. All right, so I think that's the first step. If you click on the next icon, you can actually follow the guide here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install Clerk/next.js. I'll just go ahead and open up a new terminal here, and I will just run that command. Simple enough, right? Okay, we already did the set environment keys. Now the next steps is we need to go to our _app.jsx or the tsx file, and we need to import basically this stuff. Okay, technically, we could just probably override everything with this. Let's go here. Let's close this one. Let's minimize this one. And let's go ahead and go to _app.tsx, which already exists, luckily for us, due to how T3 Stack is set up. And we can just go ahead and wrap our component, like they say in the docs, with this Clerk provider, right? Well, we do need to import this. So let's just go ahead and import it right here. There we go. So we are set up with the provider now. And what that's going to do is going to give you access to various methods to check if you're logged in inside your application. All right, so let's move on to some middleware. Middleware is basically a function that runs before all of your endpoints. So if you're trying to load a page, you can set up authentication with middleware and have the user redirect to a different page using next middleware. Definitely recommend doing that. And this is how you can do it. Just copy this, and you need to make a middleware file inside your source directory. So middleware.ts. Go ahead and paste that in. And they do provide a more advanced example down here. If you wanted to protect some of your endpoints or make some public and some private, you can actually copy this whole pattern here and just add in your public endpoints here. I don't know if we're going to get to that in this video. We might just try it a different way. But once you have that all set up, let's verify this is working. Okay, so let's go back to a main page here. And we are going to go ahead and go to like our main pages/index file. And for those who aren't really familiar with Next, hopefully you are, because this video is probably a little bit more advanced. In Next, you have file-based routing, right? So there's a folder called Pages. And inside of that folder, every file you make is going to represent a route in your application. Okay, so the root level, if you're familiar with Node, index.ts is going to point to just the slash. And if I were to make a new folder here called API, then that means that I have a subdirectory called API. And then I can do a /trpc. I can do this. Okay, that's kind of how that works. Just want to give you I definitely recommend you go read the docs about file-based routing, but it's really actually pretty simple. Every file and folder represent a route in your router. All right, so let's go ahead and simplify this, right? There's a lot of boilerplate code. I mean, it's not that much boilerplate code. Let's just go ahead and delete some of the stuff that we probably don't need. And let's make sure that we can get Clerk at least showing some type of login button or something like that. Let's try to get a sign-in form displaying in our page. So if you go down here, there's a sign-in form. There's also a sign-up form you could potentially use. I will just kind of show you this, but we're actually going to do this a different way. So if I go ahead and just put a sign-in component here and make sure you import that from Next, like this. If I go back to the UI, you'll see that you actually have a form that you can use to sign into the application. We actually want to do a sign-in button, which is another component that is provided. So if I change this to button, we'll have access to that, and we can just go ahead and put here. And then inside the button, let's just go ahead and put some text like sign in. Okay, it's very hard to see, but there's a button here. Let's go ahead and change the color a little bit. We'll say class name is equal to text of white. So it kind of is visible to what we're doing. You're getting a little bit of a TypeScript error. Maybe it'd be better to put this in a span and just go ahead and do this so we don't get that TypeScript error. All right, so let's click on sign in and let's see what happens. And notice that it's going to take us to a separate page where we can sign in to Clerk. And if you don't have an account, it'll ask you to sign up. Okay, so if I click sign up, it takes you to a sign up page. Simple enough. So let's actually try this out. I'm going to go ahead and sign in with GitHub. Let's try GitHub. It would have asked you for permission in GitHub to sign up, and you click OK, and then it redirects you back to this page, and you have a session set up. Let's go ahead and look at the session to make sure we understand what's going on. So if we go down to your cookies, you should have a session set up here. And I believe this is the session that's related to Clerk. Okay, so if I were to go ahead and just like delete all this and refresh the page, you'll no longer be signed in. Now, just to kind of demo what I just said, I want to make this sign in button change to a sign out button if you're not logged in. So how do you do that? Well, in Next and using the Clerk API, there is a method called use client. I'm sorry, it's called use user. And we can basically just say const user is equal to use user. And that is how you can get access to know if you're logged in or not. Okay, if you look at this user object, you have is logged in, or sorry, is loading, is signed in, and user. So if you wanted to dynamically show content on your page based on if you're signed in or not, you could just go ahead and do some curly braces, and I'll say user.is signed in. And then if you are signed in, just do a ternary here. I'll go ahead and say sign out button. Okay, sign out. Like that. Otherwise, I will default to a sign in. Now let's go ahead and add that same white text. We'll come back and fix up the stylings later, but I just want to kind of show you the important part of like getting authentication set up first. So now if I click sign out, that should hopefully get rid of my session. See how I still have a session here? I'll click sign out, and now my session's gone. I'd have to sign back in to get authentication. And that's really how simple it is with Clerk. You basically just install Clerk, you set up an application, you set up some middleware, you wrap your main app with a provider, and then you can start using these different various library functions that they provide you. And after you actually sign up, if you go to clerk.com and you go to your dashboard, you can actually see how many users are registered in your system, how many people signed up, and you can get more information about all of the different users. By going to your users dashboard, you can get their emails, you can click into them, you can see more information about the user if you want, their names, their icons, stuff like that. You can also ban and delete users from this dashboard, which is pretty cool. But the important thing that we're probably going to care about most is this user ID. This is a unique ID that you're going to be using in your database so that you can scope data models to their user. So let's go ahead and actually commit what we have. I'll say adding Clerk auth. And I'll just go ahead and add this. I'm going to try to do small commits throughout this project in case you ever want to go back and look at my commit history. All right, so what are we trying to build? We are trying to build an online marketplace. So the first thing I think you want to do is give the ability for people to create some type of item that they want to sell, right? So we are using the T3 stack and we have Prisma for our ORM. So I think it makes most sense to start with Prisma and kind of walk you through how kind of that works. So for anyone unfamiliar with Prisma, when you have Prisma set up, you have basically a library that lets you quickly query and write data to your database. If you're using Postgres or SQLite or MySQL, there is a schema file you can come into and you can just kind of change your provider. Right now we're using SQLite because it's just easier to hit the ground running with everything locally. But when you deploy, you're probably going to use Postgres or MySQL, depending on what service you have your database hosted on. And you'll notice here that we also have a URL that's defined. If you go back to the .env file, we had a database URL, and that defines the SQLite file location. And then down here, you can start defining Prisma models. So in our example, we have an example model that has an ID, an updated at, and an created at. So what we want to store in this application, we don't want this example model. What we could do is just overwrite this, and we're going to add a listing or an item. What would you call it? We'll call it a listing. And this listing needs to have a couple of things. So we're going to go ahead and keep some of these defaults. But what we want to do is we're going to also add like a name. Like, what is the name of the item? Is it a bed? Is it a Xbox 360? We're just going to go ahead and put some things that might be useful. Name, description. How about that? By the way, I do have a Prisma extension installed, which is why I get the syntax highlighting. So I recommend you have that set up. It helps you with auto formatting, and it also helps you with the relationships between entities. Okay, but I think the important thing we need to do, we have the name, we have the description, probably a price, like how much do you plan to sell this for? That seems like it should be good. But we also need to keep track of the user who uploaded this. So I'm going to say user ID, and we're going to put that as a string as well. And that's going to be the clerk ID that I kind of showed you over here. If I go back to users, we're going to try to store that user ID, which is this string, directly in our database, so that we can know which user has created this listing. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our app. And first of all, our app looks kind of bad, so we should probably style this a little bit, right? So there's tons of Tailwind CSS libraries. One I like using is called Flowbite, but there are a lot of other ones. This one has a bunch of free components you can potentially use, but feel free to find the ones that you like. I just want to get something quick, so I can type in like header. Actually, it might be called navigation. Let's go to navigation. Called NavBar. So I want to add a NavBar, okay? And it's going to look like this. Pretty straightforward. We're going to go ahead and just copy this whole thing, and we're going to use this in our application. So let's go back to source. And I want to add a components directory, and I want to add one called navbar.tsx. Now I will say Flowbite has a React package that you basically can just get a bunch of components that work. I'm just going to grab the HTML and just modify it a little bit, because I do kind of think it's a little bit easier for a beginner who's like watching a project. But if you're the type of person who'd rather go find React components, you can go do that. Or just go find a different type of component library. So we're going to make a function called navbar, and we're going to export it, and we're going to return all this JSX. Now, when you do that, unfortunately, it's a bunch of HTML, and class is not the proper way to do this. So let's just go ahead and replace this with class name, and boom, we're done. Now, sometimes there's other properties that you'd have to go and modify to get this working. So we'll see if this complains or not. Let's see what this is complaining about. This is just Next saying you should use the image tag instead, but we don't want to do that. Let's go back to our main pages, and we are going to go ahead and import that navbar, and we're going to put that at the top of our page. Let's just go ahead and say navbar like that. And if we did this correctly, we should have a navbar show up in the app, and it does. Now the issue, obviously, is because we nested this navbar inside the main. We probably want to move it up to a higher level. And what we could do is we could actually put this in app, I believe. If you wanted to put this here above your component, you could potentially do that. Let's try that. And now we have a full page navbar. Let me go ahead and move my head so you guys can see this. All right, we got a navbar. It looks pretty good. And yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this to the right. Now we should have access to the navbar. Hopefully it's not hidden by my head anymore. Okay, so let's delete the one here because we don't want that one. That's kind of weird. Go back here and let's save. That should go away. Now, again, what we wanted to do is we wanted to add the sign in and sign out buttons to the top of this. And we could also add a cool social media icon, right? So first of all, if you're using Clerk, there's something called a user button. And the user button is going to give us access to basically our face like this, and you can click it and it gives you a drop down of awesome stuff. So let's just go ahead and add a user button here. Let's go to the navbar, and we're going to find where we want to put this. Let's just go ahead and put this as another LI, and we're going to go ahead and just import user button real quick. Let's make sure this shows up in the page. So it's not showing up because I'm not logged in. So again, let's click sign in, and we're going to go ahead and sign in with GitHub. And now we have a nice icon. If I click it, we get a manage account and a sign out option. Okay, so I can now sign out really easily just by clicking this. I don't need to have this button here in the main page. So let's remove some of these links. I think I might just keep home for right now, but the other ones can kind of go away. Do we want to keep these? Probably not. Let's just go ahead and just keep home. Save that. Now we have home, and we have this little icon over here. Looks okay. But if you're not signed in, let's just click sign out. We probably want to add a sign in button. Let's just go ahead and copy home like that. I'm going to say sign in, but we want it to be a Clerk sign in. So how do we do that? Well, if you go back to this page, we're going to go ahead and find that sign in button here. Go back to our navbar, and now we'll go ahead and just paste in that button. Go ahead and import that. And we do want some of the same styles here. Like, I think we could probably just keep darkest text white, hovering as MD blue. Let's go ahead and grab the blue stuff at the very least. Actually, I don't think we want that. Let's just let's just go ahead and paste that in, and I'm gonna delete this. Let's see what happens. Now we got a sign in button. Now it doesn't have a hover state, which is kind of weird. So let's just go ahead and say like, I think it's called cursor pointer. Okay, so now we got a pointer, and then when you hover over it, we should probably like hover MD or say blue text blue 400. Probably should keep it consistent. I think it's using 700 there, so let's just go ahead and do 700. Maybe they're doing 500. Anyway, let's not get too caught up on a color of a button. So now we can remove the sign in from the main page. Let's go back to index. Let's delete all this stuff. And now our code is a little bit cleaner. We don't have duplicate stuff everywhere. Go ahead and delete some stuff we're not using. So how are we doing so far? Let's just go ahead and add a commit. I'll say adding a NavBar and also add new model for storing listings. Now, one thing I forgot to do is we didn't run a Prisma DB push. Let's just go ahead and commit this stuff before I forget. But when you change your schema, you actually want to go ahead and run command to update all your TypeScript files to reflect those changes. And you also want to update your database so that it has a new model, right? If I show you, if I say NPX Prisma Studio, this is a cool tool that Prisma gives you that's going to host a service where you can go and actually view the data in your database. Okay, now right now it's crashing because it's like the Prisma schema that we updated is not matching the database. So let's go over here. I'm going to make a new terminal. Now we got 3 terminals going. It's crazy. I'll say NPX Prisma DB push. That'll update your local SQLite database. Now, if I refresh this page, you will have access to listings. Okay, a little bit small. Let me log out and show you. You got listings here. And I can come in here and I can manually add a listing if I want to. I could add a record. But we're just going to try to do this in the UI instead of manually doing this. So just keep that in mind. Anytime you change this Prisma file, you need to either create a migration script or just do a Prisma DB push. And those changes will be pushed to your database. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to give a user the ability to basically create a listing, right? Sell an item. So we should probably go to the NavBar and let's just add another one called, I don't know, upload or sell an item. How about that? I don't know what the best terminology is, but we're going to go ahead and do that. And we're going to be using, instead of an A tag here, an anchor, we're going to do a link. We want to use next link, and we're going to have a user go to another page called list and item. Okay. So now if we go back to our app, we should have sell an item up here. In fact, let's just call this sell an item and keep it kind of consistent. And when you click this, it should take you to a new page called sell an item. Okay, but we don't have a page or a file created for this route. So let's go back to over here. I'm going to go to pages and I'm going to go ahead and say create a new page and I'm going to call it sell an item.tsx. Now I think you have to say export default function, get this working, and let's just return like a div that says hello. Make sure this works. Actually, I think I have this wrong. Let's follow how we do it here. So I believe, let's just copy this whole page. It might be a lot easier to do that. And we're going to rename this to sell an item. All right, and we're going to go ahead and say sell an item here for the title of the page, so that in the top left of the browser, it'll say sell an item when you're there. And we could potentially just delete some of this stuff right now. Make sure this works. Okay, so we're at sell an item. You can see up here, my head is blocking it, of course. You can see up here it says sell an item. Okay, and then we also on the page sell an item. So the routing is working fine. But now what we want to do is we want to basically allow a person to enter in some information about this item. So we're going to add a form here. We'll say form. And we're going to go ahead and probably bring in use form hooks. Kind of how I would do it. Just add an H1. Every page should probably have an H1 that describes what the page is for. We should probably style this a little bit. Now, to be honest, I'm not a fan of this like gradient purple. I think it's just not the best. So let's just go ahead and see where we can remove that. And I believe that's set on, is that on app? Actually, the purple is directly on these pages that I'm copying. So let's just delete those. I'm not a fan of it. Okay. But I do like the dark background. So I'm going to say BG gray. What colors do we have for gray? Let's do like a 900. How's that? And then what we want to do, maybe an 800. Okay. We want to basically make the text default to white. So I'm going to do a quick little hack here. And we're going to basically wrap everything with a div. I'm going to say class name text white. Okay. I just don't want to have to like manually set this to white everywhere. I just want it to default to white. And later on, we can add like a dark mode. So I can say dark is white. And I could say light is black. Okay. But we're not going to worry about light mode and dark mode. Like, it's just code it with one style. I think it's easier that way. And then later on, you can come back and switch your modes and like verify with better testing. All right, so sell an item. What do we want to do here? Well, we want to basically make a form where they can enter in some item information. But I mentioned we want to use React use hooks or React form hook. This is just a library that gives you a lot of utilities out of the box for creating forms with validation and all this other stuff. So we're going to go to the Get Started guide, and I'm going to go ahead and just install this. So go back to our app. Go ahead and paste that in. And we're going to go ahead and look at the example. So basically, you import this use form hook inside the page that you want to make a form. Let's go to sell an item. And let's import that. And then we're going to go ahead and just copy this stuff. Go ahead and paste that in there. And then we're going to go ahead and copy the form. And we might just kind of analyze this a little bit and take what we want from the form. Okay, so how does this work? Basically, when you're using this library, you get a handle submit function and a register function. These are used to basically register inputs against different properties that'll be on your form object. And handle submit is going to handle when the form is submitted. So simple enough, right? We don't care about error validations, but if you wanted to, you can actually like get errors for when someone doesn't enter in something. For example, this is required. And if they don't fill in the example required property, this thing will show for you. But again, let's just keep this simple and let's delete as much code as we can so that we're not overwhelmed by all the tokens. This one is complaining because of an ESLint rule, which I'm not a fan of this rule, to be honest. So I might just disable this for the entire file, or I might go back to my ESLint rules and just disable it. I think if you don't want to do that, you could just do a dot catch and say console.error. I think it just makes the code a little bit uglier, but it's for good reasons, right? You want to make sure you're handling exceptions. But anyway, so what do we want to do? The form needs to have a couple of things. Remember, in the Prisma schema, we defined a name, a description, and a price. So we want to basically set a name here. I'll just do a register of name, and we'll say description. And then we will also say price. You know, I'm going to make these all required. We're just not going to show any error validation because we might do it later. But we also will put a price here. And I think this one could potentially be a type of numeric or a number. And I think what you can actually do on numbers is you can give it like a range or a step. I think it's a step. We want to do a step of 1 cent. And what happened to my register call? Somehow I deleted it. Let's just add it back in. Okay, so let's go back and look at the form. And let's delete some of the stuff that we aren't using. So like delete that. Go ahead and do this. So you'll notice that we're using TypeScript, and this is complaining, saying that form data has a type of any. You can actually type this. If you wanted to create a form up here, I could say type sell item form. This is going to take in a name, which needs to be a string. And then it needs to take in which is a string. And then also a price would be a number. And once you define that TypeScript type, you can actually pass this in as generics here. And I believe now the form will give you some typed information about this. If I have this correctly, let's see. So yeah, if I try to register the wrong thing, it'll say, hey, this does not exist. So that kind of helps you out. Unfortunately, you don't get that type safety here. You actually need to like explicitly type it, but that's probably fine. Let's make sure this works. I'm gonna go ahead and go back to the form, and we're gonna go ahead and look at this form. It's very ugly. So let's see, is there some type of form that's built into this, like inputs or something? Let's go to the input section. And let's go to input field and let's see if they provide us a nice looking input field. They do. They have a first name and a last name and stuff like this. So let's expand the code and let's see if we can just kind of grab any of this. So I'll just grab this div and we're going to actually wrap some of the stuff. So we'll move the input up and we're going to grab the class from this. We'll say class name is equal to this input from that we got from Flowbite, and I copied over some too much stuff. What other stuff we need? We have required placeholder ID. I think we do want an ID for accessibility purposes. Let's do that, and then I'll say HTML4, and then that has name. This needs a class name. Okay, so we can go through here. We can like modify the styles. Let's just see if this looks good enough, and if it does, like, we'll keep it. I think that's fine. So instead of saying last name, we want to say like item name. And we're going to do the same thing with the other parts of our form, right? So we have name, we have description. Let's modify this to be description. Go ahead and copy this. Copy this. Okay. Description now, and then we're going to do the same thing with number. And if you want to be fancy, you can abstract this out into a React component so that you'd have cleaner code. I'm not trying to be fancy in this video though. Actually, I'm going to take this whole input here and I'm going to put these two things on this input. Okay, so this looks a little bit better, right? Now the button doesn't look that good. So let's go back to Flowbite. Let's see if there's a button that we can use. All right, let's just use the primary button here. Go ahead and paste that in. I'll say button is type submit. And we're going to add this class here. Oh wait, I already had a class. What am I doing? Yeah, that's good. Say class name and I'll say create. There we go. Now we probably want to add some spacing between all these items. So you can actually use Flexbox and you can add some gap in between all this stuff. So if you look at all the divs, you want to go to the form itself and I'll say class name, say flex call, and I'll say gap of 2. And that should space out all the items a little bit. Maybe 2 wasn't enough. Maybe we'll do like a 4. And that'll basically just put some space, as you can tell, between these things. Okay, so let's try to actually use this. I'm gonna go ahead and click create and see what happens, and nothing should happen because these are required fields, right? But if we actually add some names in here, so I'll say like, we're selling some shoes, some nice shoes. This should probably be a text area, not a text input. So let's go back over here. I'm gonna change this to text area. Okay, so we have like more real estate. And the price could be, we'll do like $14.99. How about that? Now there are some like validation things we'll have to add in, like the fact that we can keep typing in 9s is kind of weird. But again, just focus on the simple things first and we'll come back. Okay, so here, if we were to click create, right now it should console log. Go ahead and put this down here and I'll go to the console. And let's click create and see what happens. It should console log all the data that the user has typed into the form, and we can use that data to send over a request to the backend. We haven't talked about any of the backend stuff, so let's go ahead and kind of navigate through that. If you go to your source directory and you go to your server folder, there is an API directory, and if you go to root, this is where we define a TRPC router. So if you haven't used TRPC before, it's basically a way to define different namespaced endpoints that you can invoke using something called queries and mutations. And in our case, we want to make a namespace for listings. So I'll just go ahead and like rename some of this stuff. I'll say listings router, and I will say listings router. I could have added a new one, but I want to kind of just repurpose this example one. I'll say listings like this. Okay, so now we can go into that listings router and we can rename this to listings. And you'll see here, we are creating a TRPC router, but more specifically, we can create public queries and public mutations. Now, what we want to do in this example is we want to make a mutation that people can hit to basically create to-do items. So I'm going to say create, or not to-do items, create a listing. So create listing. I could just call it create. How about that? And we'll say public procedure for now. Later, we're going to come back and make it private. And then we're going to define what type of data the user has to send over to this thing for it to be valid. So we're going to go ahead and put a type here. And I want to say name is a string. We'll say description, z.string. And we'll say price, z.number. Okay. So what this is doing is basically defining the endpoint and saying what does the user have to pass over for this to be valid. And this also helps you get really nice TypeScript inference from what you defined here so that your front end knows what to send over. I don't know why this is saying, okay, so I also, after input, you need to say mutation. And this is something you can do to pass a callback. And now when I hit this endpoint, I can do some logic, right? So I can say to do save something to the DB. That's what we want to do, okay? So luckily, with the T3 stack, there's this context object like this. And the context, if I pull it in from this parameters list, this has something called Prisma on it, in which you can use to create for items. So I can say context.prisma, and then I can go ahead and find listing because we updated the Prisma schema over here. And when you add or change a model here, those will automatically show up in TypeScript, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and say listing, and then I'll say create. And the way to create something in Prisma is you say data. And for right now, we're just going to say input. Okay, input is going to be the exact same thing that they uploaded to us. And we are getting a little bit of an error. Let's figure out why we're getting an error. So this is saying create unsafe return of any typed value. No, I'm going to go ahead and say listing, and I'm going to wait on this real quick. And then I'm going to return listing here. I don't know if that's what it's complaining about. Sometimes you have to restart your, this ESLint that's complaining. Sometimes you have to restart ESLint. So I'm going to do that to see if that's maybe the issue. And it looks like that was part of the issue. Just restart ESLint and your errors will kind of go away. But this one is complaining that something is missing. So we have name, description, price. What we don't have is the user ID. Okay, so let's actually do this. I'm going to do ... input. And we need to actually provide the user ID because that's required and it's not being passed in. So how do we get the user ID? Right? That's the question, is how do we get the user ID? So let's command click onto this. And I want to show you another file that we're going to need to kind of set up to get access to the user ID. So this is where you define like your Prisma context and the things that you'll have access to inside of this context thing. And what we want to try to do is we want to provide the auth here, right? We want to get the user. And what we could do is we're going to go ahead and just say, we're going to change this a little bit. We're going to change this a little bit to auth here, and we'll say auth context. And this is a Clerk related thing, I believe. And then inside of here, we'll say interface auth context. And we're going to say auth is equal to signed in auth object or signed out auth object. Okay, so this is just basically creating an interface that we can use to know if the user is signed in or not signed in. And then what we're going to do is down here, we are going to pass in auth, and we're going to call a Clerk method called getAuth, and we're going to pass it that request object that we got. Okay, so this, what I'm showing you right here might be a little bit over some people's heads if you're kind of new. So I would just say, remember this boilerplate. I'm going to change this. This needs to be _ops. Now if I can get auth, let's make sure we import that. And hopefully, if we did this correctly, what this is going to do is we should have access to that auth object inside of our mutations and stuff. Now there is one last thing that we need to kind of get set up. I don't know why I put the imports down here. Let's go ahead and cut those things. And we're going to put them up here. Kind of weird that my VS Code put them down there. And I will say type so that we have these lint errors. Okay, the last thing, we have a public procedure already created. But what we want is we want a private procedure so that you can only access this API endpoint if you have logged in. So I'm going to say protected procedure. And by the way, I am kind of reading off another monitor to get some reference code. This isn't stuff I'm like memorized. This is stuff I have to actually figure out. Is auth. Okay, so basically we're making a method you can use to verify that they're authorized. Now, the last thing we need to do is we need to create an isAuth method. Let's just go ahead and do this. And I'll say t.middleware. T is like your TRPC object. And you can create something called middlewares, which run before like your mutations and your queries. And we're going to go ahead and just do this. We're going to get the next object and the context object. So what we can do is we can say if there is no auth.userid, then we're going to go ahead and just throw an error. So throw new TRPC error. And we're going to say code is unauthorized. Okay. Make sure you auto import this. And then otherwise, we will just return the next step in the route. And we'll say context, and we want to basically provide that auth like this. Okay, that'll basically merge some new data into the existing context. So all this stuff, I mean, it's kind of boilerplate. So if you don't want to like figure out what's going on, you could just clone the repo and do this yourself or take this file. But this was all so that we can change this to a protected procedure. And when you do that, I can say context, I can get auth, and I can get the user ID like this. Okay. And this method will fail if you're not logged in. So it's kind of like a protected route now that I have access to the user ID and everything should be good. I do realize that I named price string. That's not what we want. We want to make this a float probably so that it can actually be stored as a number. So I think I need to go back over here and I need to say db push so that my Prisma gets updated and my TypeScript gets updated. Okay, so now it's happy. So let's test this out. Let's go back to the UI. And I'm going to go ahead and click create. Oh, wait, this won't work. This won't work yet. So all that work was so that we have the ability to call a protected create procedure on our backend. Simple enough. So how do we actually call it from the front end? Well, let's go and uncomment this. This is how you can hit endpoints using TRPC. You basically import this API from utilities. And instead of saying example, remember we called it listings. And then we have a method that we created called create. And we're going to say use mutation. And we're going to go ahead and just say create listing. And for this to work, I don't need to pass it any text here. Let's just go ahead and delete that. We can basically, when the form was submitted, remember we have this callback function. I will say create listing .mutate async. And we're going to go ahead and just pass it form data. And I believe that might be all we need. I'll just go ahead and say like form data. And I think this thing might be complaining because of my ESLint error again. No floating promises. Right now, we don't care, so just ignore that. Okay. I want to make sure this works. So if I go back to my UI, I'm going to go ahead and type in some stuff. So I'll say like shoes, yes, and then $18.99. So if this all works, when I click create, that should make a request to a backend and try to create my listing. But unfortunately, I got an unauthorized exception because I'm not logged in to the UI, I don't think. So I probably need to make sure that I sign in first, which you can't see over my head, but I'm not signed in. So let's sign in. And we probably also want to make this route be protected so that a user cannot hit this page unless they're signed in. Okay, so which one do we want to work on first? Maybe we'll work on the protected thing. So let's go back to the clerk example and let's go to middleware. we're going to take all this basically. We're going to go ahead and copy this whole thing, and we're going to go back to our middleware file, and we're going to paste this all in. Hopefully this works, but we basically want to add in a route here. Actually, I think this should just work. Let's just try it out. Okay, let's go back to sell an item. Let's refresh the page. And what this should hopefully do, if we're not signed in, that should redirect us to the sign in page, which it kind of tried to do. I think there's a little bit more code that we're going to have to do because we don't know where the sign in page is. So let's go back, and I'm going to make a new page called sign in. Go to pages here. I will make one called sign in, and we're going to make a TSX file with 2 brackets here called index. And we're going to basically, I have some example code. I'm going to paste in this. I know you guys are going to be like, why did you just paste in a bunch of code? Basically, I want this so that when this page loads, it's automatically going to show you that sign in widget that we talked about. Okay. And we're going to do the same thing with sign up. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of copy this directory, and I will call it sign up. And we're going to go ahead and just change this up a little bit. So instead of saying sign in, we will say sign up. Don't change that one though. All right, so let's verify, does this work now? So let's go back to the other page, and we're going to go click on sell an item, and notice that it takes us to a page that shows that sign in form. We can just go ahead and sign in. One thing I noticed that we probably shouldn't even show sell an item if you're not logged in, right? So I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but this is where the coding starts getting fun, right? We want to not show this if you're signed in. How do we know if we're logged in or not? I kind of described that earlier on. You just say const user is equal to use user, like so. And then I'm going to go down to sell an item, and I will say I only want to do this if the user is not signed in. Oh, I'm sorry, if the user is signed in. I'm confusing myself. Okay, so just dynamically show that link if you're signed in. So now we're not signed in, so you don't see it. And I hid my camera a long time ago, and I forgot about that. So now we're not signed in, but I'm going to go ahead and move this over to the right some. So let's go ahead and sign in now, and now we should see a button show up in the top header called sell an item, and you can actually go to this page now, and you're not going to be kicked off and go like forced to go back to a sign in page. Now this says sign in here. I'm going to actually get rid of that. We don't want the sign in to show. So we're going to also wrap this thing over here and say if we are signed in, or sorry, if we're not signed in, then show a sign in button. Okay, so let's get rid of that button. So now let's just verify. If I sign out and I go back to home, although home's not taking us anywhere, so we got to fix that too. Let's make this a link. It's always a good idea to just randomly click to your UI because you probably have stuff that's broken. So let's click on home and make sure it allows us to go. This one is actually not going to work because we changed it. So let's just manually go to sell an item and make sure it redirects us to sign in, and then we can click sign in, and then we get access to do this. So let's try this again. Say shoes. I'll say $18.99, and I will click create. Okay. So it worked. It got a little bit further, but now it's saying it expected a number, but it received a string. And I think the issue is that when you submit the form, I believe we are getting back data that's actually a string. Yeah, price is a string. Okay, so what I'm actually going to do, this will be like a little hack, is I'm actually going to parse the number over. So I'm just going to apply form data, and I'll say price is form data price, and I'm going to say parse float. Okay. Maybe it's better to just throw over the I'll make this a string, but then I'm going to parse it. Okay. It's a little bit hacky. There's probably a better way to do this with the hook form library, but again, let's just do the simplest thing first. And I will click create, and that should have, let me refresh the page. Maybe there's something going on here. Okay, so that hit the backend, but are we getting different types of errors? Let's go back to network tab over here, and I will click on listings, And if you look at the error, it's saying internal server error, cannot read properties of create. Listings.create. So I think with Prisma, what I've seen is sometimes when you change your Prisma schema, like just hard refresh your server, because sometimes it doesn't load in the TypeScript changes properly. So let's try this again. I'm going to click create. And now everything's working. We got a 200 status code. Everything's green. All right, so a lot of little work just to create an item, but the thing I wanted to show you is that once you've done that and you go to your listings, okay, so go to your listings and now we have that listing that we just added in shoes, ASF, and then the price, okay? Pretty cool. Now we're actually saving an item in the database and we can probably work on displaying that item now. So one thing I wanted to do is when you create an item, we should probably redirect the user back to like a main home page. So let's go back to sell an item. And we're going to go ahead and after we call mutate async, let's just do a .then. And we're going to dynamically route to another page. So with next, you can get the router like this. And then you can say router.push, and we're just going to go to the home page here after you successfully have created a new listing. So let's try it one more time. I'm going to go ahead and put something in here, and now it'll redirect us when we're done creating that item back to the home page. So on the home page itself, what we should probably do is we should grab all the items that are for sale and just list them out in like cards or something. So let's try to figure that out. Again, actually before I do that, let's go ahead and just commit. I want to say adding ability to create an item. List an item for sale. How about that? Again, small commits, definitely a good approach. So on the home page, how do we add the ability to view all the items that are for sale? Well, let's go to server and let's go to the root. Let's go to the listings router. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a public procedure so that anyone in the UI can view items for sale. So I'm just going to go ahead and say list, and I'll say public procedure. And we want to basically add a query like this. And we're going to add a callback here. And what we want to do is we want to get that context object. And then we're going to basically say return context dot prisma dot listing dot find many. We can just call it with the empty object, and I'll get every listing that's in our system and return it back to whoever is calling this, right? So on the front end, let's go to the home page. We're going to modify this a little bit, and instead of trying to get data from a hello endpoint that doesn't exist anymore, we will say listings, and then we'll say list, and then we'll say use query. We don't need to pass it any data right here. Keep it blank. And I'll just call this the listings variable name. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to loop over every listing here and map over them. So let's see if there's like a card component that's built into here. Let's just say card. We'll go to Flowbite. And we are going to go ahead and just grab this. We're not going to use images for right now. I guess technically we could use an image. Maybe it would be better if we had an image. Let's grab this. And I'm going to make a function up here called card. And we're going to go ahead and just return that JSX that we copied from Flowbite. And let's rename class to class name. That. Save it. Make sure this works. And again, since we have all the listings here, what we could do is we can just map over the listings. So I said listings question mark dot data dot map. I'll say listing, and we want to basically render out cards based on all the listings that we get back. Now this is complaining because we don't put a key here. So I'm going to say listing.id. And the cool thing about TRPC is that we had that type safety, right? We know that this is a listing and we know all the information that came back from it. So that's pretty cool. Let's go back to our UI and notice that we have two cards printing out. Now we have a bunch of lorem ipsum, like placeholder text. So we want to actually pass in the listing here. And we're going to go up to our card and we're going to say listing. And then we're going to say props listing is a listing. Go ahead and import that from Prisma client. So we get that type safety, and if you add type in front of here, that lint error will go away. But what we want to do is we're going to use this listing information, and we're going to display the title here. I'll say like the name. We will say listing.description. Now there's some weird layout going on the page. I don't like this like purple stuff. Let's get rid of the purple gradient. Let's go ahead and make this a BG gray 800. And what we could do is probably make this in like a grid and have a certain amount. So instead of saying flex painter here, I'm going to say grid, and then I'll say grid falls 4. And hopefully that's good enough. Let's see. So we should have some cards here. We probably want an H1 on this page that says like, I don't know, H1 items for sale. Okay, and we're going to get rid of the flex here, and we're going to get rid of the, oh, I need to move this up above the grid. Okay, and then some of the stuff here, like item center, justify center, I don't like. Let's get rid of that. And we could probably also like give this some bigger text. I'll say like text for Excel. Margin top of 12. I don't know why that's pushed up to the top so much. Padding left 4. Let's just hack this together and make it look a little bit nicer. And there you have it. So now you can view all of the items. Let's actually add one that seems to make sense. So I'll say like Nike shoes. These are fair condition shoes, which I've owned for 6 months. Maybe some athletes put inside of it. I don't know if I spelled athletes right. Probably not. I'll say the price will be $129.99. Go ahead and click create, and there you have it. So not the best. This thing probably needs to be expanded a little bit. I think what's happening is that there's a ton of gap here. We should probably add a smaller gap, like this. Maybe a gap of 4 look nicer. And then maybe a grid of 3 would look better too. Okay. I also don't like that these things are variable in height. So like on the card itself, we could potentially just give it a height of some type of fixed thing. We'll say 60 there, so that they're all kind of consistent. And this text here probably should also be consistent as well. Or you could probably push the button to the bottom, but I'm actually just going to say the height is going to be 32. 28, how about that? And then items for sale, we should probably put some margin at the bottom of that. You could also do like gap on this if you wanted to. That might be a better approach. This could be a gap of 12 instead of the margin bottom. Awesome. So we're now displaying the items on the homepage, and that's pretty cool. I'm gonna go ahead and commit this. I'll say displaying items on homepage. All right, so I think the next steps is let's just clean up the header a little bit. I don't like how it says Flowbite in the NavBar. I'm gonna go ahead and say like marketplace, something like that. You don't have to worry about the logo. Instead of home, maybe I'll say like browse. Or not browser, browse. And that'll help us, users be able to find items that they want to buy. I don't know how many features I plan to add in this tutorial. I think something that would be necessary is allowing a user to send a message to someone who's trying to sell an item. Because honestly, we could keep on adding and adding and adding, but I do have to like at some point stop the tutorial due to time constraints. So I wonder if instead of view here, we can actually have it be called like message or something. So let's actually make a page where you can view the individual item for sale. So if I click view, we need to have that go to a particular page. So let's go here and let's figure out where we are displaying that view button. It's inside this card. And if you scroll down, there is a view link. So we should change this to a next link like this. And put a link here. And inside the href, let's just go to, we'll say like listings, and then we will do the listing ID. Okay, like this. So I'm gonna go ahead and do like some string interpolation here. I'm struggling to type right now. And we want to get the listing ID that we clicked. So how do we get the listing ID? Well, it should be part of that property that was passed in. We have the ID right here. So let's just go ahead and pass that in. So now if you were to click on the view button, it should take you to a page that has the entire listing ID. So now we have to create a page for displaying the listing information for that ID. So let's just go ahead and make a new folder called listings. And inside that listings folder, I will make a file called ID. And I believe this is how you could potentially do it. I'm going to copy and paste this existing file as a starting point, and I will say view listing. And what do we need here? So instead of home, let's rename this to listing view. And this whole card component here can go away. We don't need to have that copied over. And we can also delete this. So we have the listing ID, and what we need to do is we need to fetch the information for that in particular listing, for that specific listing when they load this page, because people could potentially bookmark this, and you want to basically allow this to fetch all the fresh data when they load it in the browser. So we don't have a way to do that. So if you go to the listing router, remember that TRPC router that we created, let's just call one get, and I'll make this a public procedure. This is going to be a query. That's going to take in some context, just very similar to how we did it before. Like this. And the main difference is this thing needs an input, right? We need the ID that we're trying to fetch. So let's go ahead and put an input here. And we're going to go ahead and say listing ID is a string that's required, and all the other stuff is not required. And we're going to go ahead and pull that in as input inside of the properties of that parameter that's passed in that we destruct. So how do we get the item from the database? Well, we've done it before down here. Well, this is, let's see, up here we've done find mini. So I think what we can actually do is we can say return context Prisma. I'll say listings dot find unique. Okay, and this is how you can basically find one listing, and I'll say where, and we want to get the listing where the ID matches the listing ID that was passed in. Okay, so this is now available to us in the UI, and we can call that get endpoint. We can pass it the ID, and we can get back the information. Let's go back to our listing page, and let's just go ahead and change this up a little bit. So instead of saying listing.list, I will say .get, and this thing needs the ID, right? We don't know how to get the ID yet. So let's actually pull in something called the router. And once you have the router, you can actually get the params that are in this URL here. Okay. Again, this is built into Next, and if you want the params, you just say router dot. I think it's just. Actually, I don't like getting the IntelliSense. Let's make sure we auto import this. It should be router.params, I thought, right? Or maybe it's router.query. I think it's router.query. Let's just go ahead and print this out just in case, but I'm going to go ahead and just print out the ID. And I'll comment this out. And basically, the way we name the file with these brackets and the ID allows us to access that using .id here. So if I've done this correctly, we should see in a console log, if I go over here, refresh the page, we do see it print out this ID. Now it's good to point out that the ID is actually undefined while the component is being like rendered and hydrated. So we'll have to keep that in mind when we do our query. But basically, if we want to get the listing information using this use query, what we could do is we could pass in the listing ID like this. I'll say router query ID. But then we're going to also pass in an additional option here that says like enabled. And we only want to do this if listing or if router query ID is defined. Okay. Now I do think this has an issue because ID could potentially be undefined. So we're going to say as string like this. And I think this needs to be a Boolean. So let's just do that. There we go. Okay, so now this should do a request to the backend if the ID is actually defined. And we can actually verify this. If I were to load up the network tab, clear it, refresh the page, you should see it do a request to listings.get, and it returns some data here. So I think we're good. I know the data is kind of off the screen, so let's pull it over. If you look here, we have a JSON and we have the Nike shoes. So everything is being fetched back from the API correctly from our TRPC router, and that is all working fine. So now that we have the data, we should probably display it, right? Let's go ahead and use that listing variable here. And I'm going to go ahead and just say listing.name. Actually, it's listing.data.name because this thing could potentially not be defined. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if there is no listing.data, we're just going to go ahead and return like that. But then if it is defined, I will just go ahead and say const listing equals listing.data. Let me actually, I think I'm overloading some stuff. Let me go ahead and pull this up here. I'm going to say listing item is equal to this. And then if this thing is not defined, we will go ahead and return. But if it is defined, we're going to go ahead and print out the name. So we should see Nike shoes pop up, and that's good. Everything's working fine. Some other things we could do is put the description here. Like this. I will go ahead and put a description. So we could say a p tag and say listing item dot description. And then we probably want to display the price. So let's just say price and put a money sign in front of here. There. We should probably also wrap this in a container like this so that the stuff is contained. Oh, actually, no, we need to do it here. Let's just go ahead and put this whole thing in a container. That basically just adds some padding and margin to the right of this stuff. So as you kind of scale, it won't go off the page. But I do believe we need an MX auto here to center this. There we go. And then here we could probably give it flex call, gap of 12. Put some space in between this stuff. Why does Nike shoes have so much margin and padding? Let's go ahead and get rid of that padding here. Okay, so what we kind of want to do is we want to allow a user who is logged in to message another person and say, hey, you know, I want to buy this. So let's try to figure out how we could do that. Okay, so how do we do messaging? I think what would help is we can go back to the Prisma schema and let's make a new model here. I'll call it like a message. And we want to create a message that it's kind of between two users, right? So I'm going to go ahead and add a unique ID to the message so we can kind of track it. But then we need a user here. I'll say like to user, and that could be just a user ID. I'll say string. And I'm also going to say from user, which would be a string as well. So what we could potentially do is just denormalize the data and just have like maybe the user name stored here. If that makes sense. So we'll say from user name, and I will say to user name. Okay. If you don't know what denormalization is, it's basically a way to duplicate data into multiple different places to allow faster lookups at the cost of when you update this username, it's going to be very hard to go and update all these messages, right? So there's a trade-off, but I think in this situation, I think denormalization makes sense since we don't have access to the actual user model. But you could potentially, when you first log in, you could take the clerk information and store it as a model in your database if you want to. We're going to try to keep this as simple as possible. All right, so hopefully this works fine. We also probably want to keep track of the product ID or the listing ID. And in this case, we could potentially just put a, I think we could type this as listing and save that. And now notice that we automatically get a reference from listing that points to messages. I'll rename that to message. And then this thing will, I'm going to name this listing. Okay, so move that down there. Basically, I'm mapping the listing to the message. So a listing can have multiple messages attached to it. So how do we actually allow users to message each other? Well, on the listing page itself, we could check if you are logged in, then you can send a message. So let's just go ahead and say, we're going to do const is logged in. In fact, we could just get the user. I'll just do this. Remember, you can use the clerk use user function. This, it's a hook, so you have to make sure you do not call it conditionally. I'm going to put it up here. But what we're going to do is we're going to take that user and we're going to basically render it out a message button. If I'll just go ahead and say like this, user dot is signed in. Then I want to display some type of messaging thing. I'll just make a button, I guess. Just say send message. And we can kind of take the button that was over here on the card. I think we had like a card on the main page here. Go ahead and grab this link here. And we are going to go ahead and use something similar without all the SVGs. I don't think we need this SVG stuff here. So I'll go ahead and delete the SVGs. And I will just cut send message and put it here and make sure that this at least shows up. I don't think we need a link. Okay, send message. So I'm going to make this a form actually. It'll just be a form, and I'm going to go ahead and just add a button here instead of a link. I don't think we need a link after all. And when you click on the button, it's going to submit the form, and I'm going to go ahead and just put a text area that is going to have, yeah, let's actually figure out how we do this on another page. We already have a form, and that's the setup or sell an item, right? So let's copy some of the stuff that we're doing over here with like the hook forms. We'll go ahead and paste that right here. And we're going to go ahead and go down a little bit, and we're going to copy this approach that we did for one of the items. And we're going to go ahead and paste that in to the form itself right here. So we should have a text area. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure I import register, which the IntelliSense is not coming up for register. So let's just go back to the sell page, and let's just make sure we auto import whatever we need to import to get this working. So I'm going to grab everything. I'm going to put it up here, and then I'm just going to delete anything that's like duplicate. We don't need that. Don't need that. Don't need that. Use form use router. Okay. I think there's only one new thing we had to add there. So what is this thing complaining about? At this point, we don't have a type we can set to this. This thing could be any. And yeah, let's just actually put the submit function here. This. And that should at least let us type it a little bit easier. And handle submit should have been pulled up here. So we're going to cut this and delete this function. Okay, I'm going to make sure I return null there because I think ESLint or TypeScript was complaining. But I think this is good. We do have an ESLint issue. I'm just going to skip it for this file. Okay. And what we want to do is when someone were to fill in this form for like the message, we want to basically keep track of that message here. And when that form data comes over, we need to submit that. So we don't have a way to create a message yet. So what I might do is I'm going to go back to our router. And I'm just going to go ahead and add one here into the router. You might want to add another router called like messages. But I think it's fine when your app is small just to put stuff where you think it might go and don't overthink it. So I'll say like send message on the listing itself. And we're going to say this is a private procedure. In fact, let's just do a shortcut. I'm going to copy and paste this existing code like this. And this thing needs to take in a message like that. And it's private because you have to be logged in to send messages. All right, that's kind of a requirement that I'm doing in the system. But we should have access to the user. So what we could do is we could say Prisma dot, actually we don't have the IntelliSense. Okay, so remember if you change the Prisma schema, you actually need to go and first of all stop your API, do a DB push. That'll restart and refresh your schema, and then I'm going to rerun server like that. And then we're going to go ahead and say Prisma dot message, and we want to create a new message, and we want to make sure that we pass the correct data between these things. So let's just go ahead and do this. And I think we called it from user, and then we called it actually, did we even save the message on the schema? I don't think we did. Listing ID. Yeah, we don't even have the message here. Like, let's just go ahead and store message. Again, you got to go back to your terminal, rerun Prisma DB push, rerun the dev. Okay. And we want to make sure that we define all these required fields. Like all these things, they are required to get this working. Okay, so let's make sure we pass in the required things. First of all, let's copy these things in and let's replace string like this. Okay, so if we want to create a message, what do we need to pass in? We need to pass in who we're sending the message to, which we'll figure that out by the listing ID. I think we probably need to also pass in the listing ID here, so we know what listing we're trying to send a message to. From username, we can get that from user. So I'll say context auth. I think it's like .user or something. Missing a colon here. That's probably why this is complaining. All right, so we'll say auth dot, I think it's called name. User dot name, first name, last name, username. Okay, let's try that. So we'll know who sent the message like this. From user could be context auth user ID. Then to username, we don't know what the username is yet. Listing ID. Yeah, so that's going to come from input dot listing ID. The message will come from input dot message. And the to user, and now that I think about it, we don't need to user and to username. We have the listing ID. So let's actually delete some of this stuff. And again, you can just delete this to user and to username. Like we don't need that. Okay. When you change stuff, you just do a push, you do a dev, right? There's nothing wrong with like making mistakes and just fixing it like I just did. Okay? You're not going to get the code perfect. So don't be worried about like trying to get everything perfect the first time. So I think it's complaining about this. Like I think this needs to be a string. What is this complaining about? I'm going to restart my ESLint server because I think it might just be kind of messed up. But in this case, I think we're good. We have a way to send a message to a listing, and we're going to go ahead and try to call that. So up here, I'm going to go ahead and say const send message is equal to API dot listings dot send message dot use mutation, like this. And then we can call that mutation method down here. When we get the submission, we'll say send message dot mutate async. And we're just going to send in form data for right now. We also probably need to pass in the listing ID. So listing ID will be listing item.id. That makes sense? So what are we missing here? This thing needs a message, which I'll just do this. Just do that. I think it's because we didn't type our React form here. So I'm going to go ahead and just say message, and that's going to be a string. And I do believe that'll make it happy. Let's scroll down and make sure. Now form data should have a message in it. This thing has a message. And now it's just complaining about non-awaiting promises. I'm just going to disable that. Okay, so we should probably also clear the form, if that's even possible. I think we can do that by saying, is there a clear method? There's a reset method on the form. So let's just go here, and I will call reset. When this thing is fully done, I'll say then, and we're going to call just reset. Okay. Also, why is this thing not inside the... I think I need to put this inside the container. So let's just go ahead and put that div down here a little bit. And now it's inside container. So I'm going to say like, hello, I want to buy this. And if I click submit, that should send a message to my listing endpoint, and hopefully it doesn't crash. Did it actually work? I'm not sure. I'm going to restart my Prisma Studio real quick so that we can check if there is a message on the listing. There is one message over here. Let's click it. And it says, hello, I want to buy whatever I typed. From username is undefined for some reason, but probably fine. I am kind of curious why it didn't reset the form. We have a reset method here. We should be calling it after this mutate method finishes. So why did it not reset the form? Let me do a hard refresh and just make sure. Let's do React form hook reset form. It says it should reset it back to the default value. So I'm not really sure why that's not happening. Is this even being called? Let's go ahead and console log that, make sure that this is working. And I need to delete some stuff. Okay, there it is. I don't know why that wasn't resetting. It should have called the reset function here. But maybe I just need to do a hard refresh and everything. So we should have like 3 messages now. If I refresh this page, we should have like a bunch of messages on this listing. And the idea is if you were to log into your account, you could basically check to see if you have messages. Okay. And this might be the last thing we add. I mean, like this is just, we can keep on adding more and more and more, but I would challenge you to like continue adding on more functionality. But the idea is when you logged in and you are authenticated, let's just add another page called messages up here. I'll just go ahead and go to like the NavBar, and I'm going to go ahead and find one called, let's define one called messages here. And I'll put them here. I'll call them offers, and we'll go to an offers page. I think this is complaining because we need to put a React fragment here. So let's just go ahead and wrap this. Okay, so let's go to offers. And the idea is you want to view all the messages that you got in your system. Okay, we don't have an offers page yet, so we should probably add one. Let's go to pages. I'm going to name one called offers.tsx. And we're going to go ahead and copy the logic from the home page. Paste that in. We'll rename this page to offers. And we don't have a way to get the offers. I'm just going to delete this card real quick. So we need another router endpoint, right? So let's go back to our router, and we're going to add one more called like get messages. And again, this will be a protected procedure. Like this. And we want to basically get all the messages for a particular listing. Okay, so let's just go ahead and delete that. What we want to do is we want to get a listing. I'll say find unique. And we'll say where. And we will say, we're going to say listing, our ID is equal to input dot listing ID. And that should give us back the listing. But what we want to do is we want to get all the messages that are on that listing. So we could basically include, over here, I will say include, and then we'll say messages of true. And that should give us back all the messages that are on the listing itself. And I think we could potentially just do this. Let's just return the listing real quick. Okay, so we have a way to get the messages on a listing. Let's go back to offers. And we're going to go ahead and say listings.getMessage. And we want to get all the messages on a particular listing. So I'm going to go ahead and just pass it. We need to pass it the listing ID here, I believe. Oh, I need to call this a query. Let's call that query. And then we should be able to get back all the data. Go back to the front end. I will go ahead and just do a, actually, I think I'm thinking about this wrong. We actually need to get the user's listings. So I'm going to go ahead and say, get all the listings where the user ID is equal to auth, or I guess context.auth.user ID. That should give us back all the listings, and we want to include the messaging on all those listings. Let me go ahead and pull this out up here, complaining about something. So that should be a string. Okay, and if I were to grab it where this is. Okay, for some reason find unique is not happy with me passing string here, so I might say find mini. And we will say where user ID is equal to that, and that should give us back all the listing messages that are associated with this user. And then we could go to our offers page, and we should be able to display those, hopefully. I do think this is actually an array of listings. So we might have to actually do a flat map on this. And then we need to get the listing. I'll just say item, and we could just go ahead and return item.messages, I believe. Try this. Okay, so that should hopefully give us back all the messages. And now we should be able to get the listing ID. Oh, and now we should just be able to do a query here. So going back, I don't think this thing even needs a listing ID as an input. And we can actually get rid of the input entirely. So let's just go ahead and delete the input. And I think that should work. And let's go back to offers. And we are going to go ahead and just delete the thing we're passing into that. Let's rename this to messages. And we'll just do some renaming here. Say messages. All right, so we have messages here, and we need to basically get the message like that. And let's just go ahead and display like message dot. Well, let's put this in a div, I guess. That we can say message dot, and we will say message. I need to put a key here, so it's a key. Then we'll say message.id. And now, hopefully, we can have messages being displayed here. So let's just go ahead and save this page and go to Nike shoes. And if I were to say like, hello, send message and go to my offers, we get those messages showing up right here. So let's actually get this in a nicer view. So I think this is in a grid. Let's just go ahead and get rid of the grid real quick. And item center item, let's just get rid of that too. I will wrap this whole thing in a container, and I'll say MX auto. Go ahead and put this down here. Don't need that, don't need that. Okay, so we got some messages. Now what I will do is I'm going to put message. Maybe we could just use a table. Would a table be pretty easy? Let's go back to Flowbite and let's find a table if they have one already. Okay, this looks simple enough. Let's just go ahead and copy this table, and we're going to use that table to kind of display what offers that we get. So let's just go ahead and rename all instances of class to class name equal signs like that. And we are going to go ahead and display the from, and we will display the message like this. This is as simple as possible. And for the T body, we kind of want to display two things. So I will just go ahead and delete the other stuff. And we're going to go ahead and copy and paste this loop that we were doing before, and we're going to put it in place of this tr, that. And we're going to say key is equal to message.id. Okay. And then inside of this first column, I'm going to get rid of the table header. I don't think we need a table header. I'm going to go ahead and say this will be message.from username. And then we can also say the message itself. So if we did this right, we should see at least a table be displayed, and we got some messages, right? Right now it's saying from user unknown. I'm not really sure why that's happening, because when we create the message itself, let's just go to the listing page real quick. We should get access, like on the back end, this thing should have access to the user information. Let's just go ahead and console log what context auth.user has on it. I think there's just something that we're missing here. So let's go to browse. Go here, type something in, click send, and I'm going to go over here and verify like what prints out. Let me do it again. It's out undefined for some reason. You know, for right now, I'll just display from user, because I'm not too sure how to get the name yet. But I think this is as far as I'm going to take this tutorial. I think we actually added quite a lot of functionality. You have the ability to add an item. So you can go here, you can try to type in some information about an item that you want to sell. You can go ahead and browse for other items like this. For example, this Nike shoes that I added in. And then I can send a message to the person, and that is stored in the database. And then later, if you log in as that person who got the message, you can go to your offers, and you can see who sent you an offer and the message that they wanted to send. So pretty cool stuff. We ended up building a decently good starting place for if you wanted to build an online marketplace. Obviously, there's so much more we could add to this product, but there's only so much time in a day you can do on a video. But I hope I gave you a good overview of how TRPC works and how you can use Clerk to set up your authorization and authentication on your TRPC endpoints. It's actually really easy to use clerk.com and hook it in to have out of the box all of this social media sign-in stuff, email logins, magic link logins. Definitely cool. Definitely go check them out if you want to hit the ground running fast with authentication on your applications. Again, the link for all this code is here, online marketplace. Feel free to go and check out the code and run it locally if you want to get a better understanding of anything that I did in this video. And let's just do one final commit. I will just go ahead and add this and say ability to send messages to others. And I will go ahead and commit this and sync it up. And that's it. All right. Well, have a good day and happy coding.